Could I have a look, please, at this? In this, there is a discussion in which Ken Thompson, from whom we've heard, says, "I feel moved at this point to remind you that this channel is FOI recoverable." And then there is a picture of what looks like a face with a mouth zipped over. And then someone called Penelope, who I think is Penelope Cooper, who is identified just above that, says, "Clear the chat." Jim McMenamin says, "Happy to do so." LAN reduced from 51 to 39, but fair comment, to which you say, "WhatsApp deletion is a pre-bed ritual." Why did you think that daily deletion of messages was appropriate?
It's a slightly flippant and it's an exaggeration. I didn't daily delete my WhatsApp. My position is, as I've just described to you, that I tried to do today's work today, and if I could assure myself that that work had been managed and dealt with, then I deleted the informal messaging that had led to that moment. But this was a flippant exaggeration in an informal messaging group, and it wasn't done every day before I went to bed.
It would tend to suggest, would it not, this exchange, that all of you are keen to try to delete messages which may subsequently be recoverable in a freedom of information request.
That isn't my position.
If you did delete your messages on a regular basis, in order to accord even with your interpretation of the policy, you would have required, on a daily or regular basis, to have taken information from that and loaded it onto the corporate record. Is that correct?
In some form, I would have had to have taken the core of that decision or advice, not the informal chit-chat, but the advice and decision-making into some form of briefing or email, correct?
And that would have been a task that would have been difficult to have achieved, that translation exercise, given the volume of discussion that you've been talking about.
Well, it depends where that volume comes from. Much of government business was done in meetings, on Teams, in briefings, in conversations that we had.
I'm obviously talking about the informal messaging here.
So I don't think it was as onerous as perhaps you're suggesting to take the advice from this group, for example, about what we thought about Lanarkshire or Dundee, and assure ourselves that Jim would then take that advice and use it in the National Incident Management Team, and therefore this group could then be deleted.
Could I take you to another document, please? INQ 000268017. Page 4. And this is again, this comes from another WhatsApp chat called COVID Outbreak Group. And there is a discussion here between a number of people, which I don't want to go through in great detail, but there's a discussion here about the position in Aberdeen at that stage and the extent to which I think well, you're discussing a number of things. You're involved in the discussion. Paul Caquette, Gregor Smith. These are people who are discussing the position in Aberdeen and what might be done, broadly speaking. Is that right? Indeed.
And the COVID Outbreak Group was designed for us to have those conversations about outbreaks.
The entry at 2144, please. This is on the 30th of September 2020 at 2144. It's on page 24. At 2144 on the 30th of September 2020, in this group, you say, "Thanks all, and just my usual gentle reminder to delete your chat, particularly after we reach a conclusion. Thanks all." Could you explain what you're suggesting to the other members of this important group then?
Suggesting that we follow the guidance I've just described to you in precisely the way I've just described it.
Could you explain that in a bit more detail in this context?
So this is me suggesting that we should follow the Scottish Government guidance, that once we've reached a conclusion and that conclusion has been fed into whichever mechanism was appropriate for that conclusion, that the chat should be deleted.
Is it correct to say that some of the groups in which you're involved had an auto-delete function applied to it?
It is.
To them. Did you apply that auto-delete function?
In my memory, only once.
And what was the group in which you applied that?
It was the group we've already discussed with Mr. McMenamin and Professor Smith.
What is the consequence of applying an auto-delete function?
It auto-deletes after a period that you set.
And that deletes, whose messages does that delete?
That's a good question. I think it deletes everybody's.
So you set a function which would in a group, which would automatically delete everyone's messages without knowing whether or not the people had had the opportunity to upload any important information onto the corporate record. Is that correct?
I was comfortable in that group that the decisions we were coming to were being dealt with very, very quickly, because it's the group I've just described to you. That group was principally used on my behalf. I set it up for me in order for me to get data prior to media appearances. That's what that group was principally used for. And if you look through it, that's what most of the chat is about. It's me asking Jim for what the rate is in Borders tomorrow because I'm going on TV in the morning. There was no requirement to retain that data. Jim then subsequently used it in order to get clinical consensus for the national IMT prior to going to the national IMT, and then it could auto-delete.
If your interpretation of the policy is incorrect, and if there was a requirement to retain messages beyond those that you say you have retained on the corporate record, such that messages require to be retained showing discussions salient to the business of the Scottish Government, you have deleted such messages, have you not?
In line with the Scottish Government guidance.
Well, if I'm putting to you a proposition that your interpretation of the guidance is wrong, and I'm putting to you that in fact what one needs to do is to retain discussions salient to the business of Scottish Government, which is a wider category that I think you have accepted you have retained. Is that right?
I disagree with your interpretation of the guidance.
Well, if you just answer my question, please, on that hypothesis. Have you deleted messages if my interpretation is correct?
But it's a hypothetical question with which I disagree. I think I have followed the Scottish Government guidance and my interpretation of it is correct.
If, on my hypothesis, Professor, have you deleted messages that fall within the category as I've defined it?
I think I have followed the Scottish Government guidance and deleted messages in line with the Scottish Government guidance.
And have you applied auto-deletes, which will result in messages falling within the category as I've defined it being deleted from the corporate record?
On one occasion, I set an auto-delete in the group we've just described, and I am comfortable that that falls within the Scottish Government guidance.
Thank you. Could I move on to